The summer of 1938 had been pulling water out of the Missouri for the better part of 4 months. The Dust Bowl years had taken rainfall from the northern and central plains in quantities that bent the hydrological record, and by August the river had dropped to levels that the engineers then managing its channel from the Army Corps of Engineers district offices had not personally seen in their working careers. The channel shrank back toward its center. The sandbars that normally lay submerged through the growing season stood dry and flat in the August heat. Along the channel bends in the lower and middle reaches, banks that the river had been cutting and rebuilding for centuries were exposed down to layers of clay and rock that normal water levels never uncovered. The land itself appeared, reach by reach, along a river the institutional record had considered fully known. In a bend along the Carroll County reach of the Missouri, north of the Grand River Junction, the retreating water revealed something embedded in the outer bank. It was not a natural formation. It extended from the cut face of the bank toward the river and ran perpendicular into the bank itself for a measured length of 40 feet before disappearing into the clay at the point where the drought had not yet drawn the water down far enough to reveal what lay beyond. The stone was worked. The individual pieces were fitted against one another with a deliberate contact that natural rock deposition does not produce. The Army Corps of Engineers surveyor who found it recorded its dimensions in 8 lines of his field notebook and returned to his hydraulic measurements. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Missouri River had been managed by the federal government as a navigation and flood control project since the 1860s, but the American institutions that managed it knew its hydraulic behavior in a detail they had no equivalent knowledge of its human past. The river's channel had been established in roughly its current position by the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet roughly 12,000 years ago. In the millennia that followed, the valley it carved became one of the most continuously inhabited corridors in the interior of the continent. The peoples who built their lives along the Missouri before the arrival of European traders were not a single culture or a single moment in time. The archaeological record of the river valley extends back at least 13,000 years and contains within it evidence of successive occupations, trade networks, population movements, and architectural traditions that together form one of the most complex pre-Columbian histories on the continent. By the time French fur traders began making regular contact with the Upper Missouri peoples in the early 1700s, they were encountering the most recent layer of a human presence that had been building along that river for longer than most of the civilizations they had studied in European schools. The Mandan-Hidatsa villages that anchored the Upper Missouri trade network in the historical period were among the most organizationally sophisticated communities anywhere in the interior of the continent. Their earthen lodges, which the trader accounts consistently described with surprise at their scale and construction quality, were built to specific architectural proportions that required coordinated labor and knowledge passed carefully across generations of builders. Their agricultural system sustained populations of several thousand in permanent village sites through the development of varieties and techniques suited precisely to the conditions of the Upper Missouri floodplain. Their position at the geographic center of a continental exchange network meant that goods and knowledge arriving from the eastern Great Lakes, the Gulf Coast, the Rocky Mountain Basin, and the Pacific trade networks all moved through those Upper Missouri villages at some point in their circulation across the continent. The villages were transfer stations in a system that extended far beyond anything the trader accounts explicitly described. What the French traders and then the American expedition members after them recorded of the Mandan-Hidatsa represents a fraction of what those people knew about the river. The Lewis and Clark expedition, which wintered at a Mandan village in 1804 and 1805, gathered information about the river's course, its seasonal behavior, and the peoples living along it that was shaped entirely by what the expedition needed for its own federal purposes. The Mandan told Lewis and Clark what they asked, and what they asked was primarily geographical and navigational. The deeper knowledge the Mandan held about the river's older structures and the peoples who had worked along its banks before the current villages were established was not what the expedition had come to collect. The record of what existed along the Missouri before the Mandan arrived in the upper valley is fragmentary. The river basin surveys that the Smithsonian Institution and the National Park Service organized in the 1940s documented hundreds of archaeological sites across the upper Missouri Valley before the Pick-Sloan dams submerged them, but those surveys were conducted under intense time pressure and with insufficient funding. Even within the survey area, the teams reached only a portion of what the valley held. Sites outside the immediate reservoir inundation zones received minimal attention, and the lower Missouri, below the main dam system, was not the primary focus of the survey program. What the fragmentary archaeological record does show for the lower Missouri is a persistent pattern of site distribution along the river's natural navigation points, the confluences, the reliable crossings, the spots where the channel ran close to a stable bank, in a way that allowed a watercraft to land without being pulled downstream by the current. These are the places where people stopped when moving along the river, and where they built whatever was needed to make the stopping reliable and repeatable across seasons and years. Stone and earth construction at navigation points is documented at upper Missouri sites. The extension of that pattern to the lower river has never been systematically surveyed, and the absence of survey is not the same as the absence of structure. The Carroll County bend sits at the outer arc of a curve in the channel that, before the channelization works of the 1940s and 1950s straightened and armored much of the lower Missouri, would have been one of those natural stopping points. The bend geometry, as it appears on the pre-channelization survey maps the Corps produced in the 1920s and 1930s, placed the main current against the outer bank at a location accessible to watercraft, moving either upstream or downstream without difficult maneuvering against the current. A structure extending from that bank toward the water was not a random feature of the landscape. It was a response to what the river's natural geography made possible at that specific location, the same logic that governed every construction choice along the upper Missouri. George Catlin spent time among the Mandan in 1832, 5 years before the smallpox epidemic of 1837 killed between half and 2/3 of the population. In one of his field letters, Catlin recorded a brief observation about worked stone visible at the waterline of a section of Missouri River bank that he placed several days of travel south of the main Mandan settlements, in a lower reach that his letter does not give a precise location for. Catlin was a painter and a journalist rather than a survey geologist, and the observation appears as a single sentence in a letter rather than a formal record. He did not return to the site. No survey team followed the observation in the years that followed. The letter is held in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where it has remained since Catlin's papers were acquired in the 1870s. By the time systematic archaeological work began in the Missouri River Valley in the early 20th century, the Mandan, as a functioning civilization, had been reduced to a fraction of its original population. The epidemic had concentrated the survivors into a single village. The oral tradition that had carried detailed knowledge of the river's older infrastructure, the crossings, the structures, and the peoples who had built them before the Mandan occupied the upper valley, had been compressed and disrupted, and was being held by fewer and fewer people with each passing decade. The physical properties of the Carroll County structure, as they appear in the 8-line field note, point towards several things that natural rock formation does not produce. The surveyor recorded that the stone pieces were placed against one another with deliberate contact surfaces, a description indicating the individual stones had been worked to allow tight fitting rather than the irregular, gap-filled contact that natural deposition generates. The structure's alignment ran perpendicular to the riverbank for its full 40-foot exposed length. Lateral erosion and bedrock outcropping do not produce that geometry in the clay and mixed rock banks of the lower Missouri. Whatever was visible at the waterline in August of 1938 had been assembled by a process that required planning. The stone type recorded in the note matters for a reason the surveyor himself identified. The material was limestone, which he noted was out of place in the geology of the Carroll County reach. The bedrock exposed by the river's lateral cutting in that section of the lower Missouri is a mix of shale and sandstone consistent with the local Pennsylvanian formation. Limestone of the type described in the field note occurs in outcroppings well upstream, in the section of the river between the Missouri-Kansas state line and the junction with the Platte River in Nebraska. The stone had been moved, and moved in quantity sufficient to build a structure of the length the drought exposed. Moving limestone of that quantity from an upstream source to a downstream construction site at least 100 miles away requires watercraft capable of carrying substantial loads, a method for loading and unloading heavy stone at riverbank locations without fixed lifting equipment, and a logistical plan for assembling the material at the construction site in the correct sequence. The organizational demand is comparable in scale to the construction of the Mandan earthen lodges, which required the coordinated movement of heavy timber from locations well outside the village perimeter. The lodge construction is documented in the trade accounts and expedition journals of the historical period. The stone transport implied by the Carroll County Pier is not documented in any surviving written record, but the scale of planning the operation would have required is of the same order as what the Mandan built over generations of coordinated effort. The 40-foot measurement has functional implications that narrow the possibilities for what the structure was. In the pre-Channelization Missouri, the main navigable channel at summer low water ran close to the outer bank of major bends. A structure extending 40 feet from the bank at a perpendicular angle would place its outer end at or near the edge of that navigable channel during the low water period when river transport was most active. This is the geometry of a landing structure, long enough to reach the water, oriented to allow a watercraft to approach parallel to the bank and secure alongside the structure's outer face. 40 feet of fitted stone pier in a river of this kind is infrastructure built by people who intended to use that bank repeatedly, across seasons and years. The weathering pattern the surveyor noted without identifying as significant adds a different kind of evidence. He recorded that the fitted joints between the stones showed weathering concentrated in the interior of the joint spaces, while the outer face of the exposed stone surface was comparatively fresher. When stone weathers uniformly across its face, it indicates exposure to open air over a long period. When weathering concentrates inside joints while the outer surface remains comparatively preserved, it indicates the stone spent an extended period submerged or embedded in sediment, with water moving through the joint spaces. The Carroll County Pier shows the second pattern. Whatever was exposed at the waterline in August of 1938 had been below the surface for an extended period before the drought pulled it into view. A landing structure of this length, built from transported limestone at a natural bend in the lower Missouri, implies something on land at the bank end of the pier that made the landing worth building: a storage point, a transfer location, a settlement with sufficient population and organizational capacity to commission the stone transport from upstream and complete a construction project that required both the material and the knowledge of how to place it. The pier does not stand alone. It connects to something behind the 40 feet the drought exposed, in the bank where the drought did not reach. The 8 lines are a description without a conclusion. The surveyor measured the structure, noted its material and alignment, and continued with his hydraulic work. He was not required to do more than that, and there is no evidence that he understood the measurement he had just taken as anything other than an anomaly in the bank material of a drought-exposed bend. What the 8 lines represent, in the archive where they sit today, is the full extent of what the formal institutional record chose to record about a construction that had been waiting in the Carroll County Bank for a period none of the record has established. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Army Corps of Engineers had been managing the Missouri's channel for decades before the 1938 survey reached the Carroll County Bend. Their institutional relationship to archaeological material along the river was not hostile. It was simply outside their mandate. The Corps had been given responsibility for flood control and navigation improvement, and within that mandate they operated with a focus well documented in their project records across the Missouri Basin. An anomalous stone structure at the waterline of a drought-exposed bend was not a navigation hazard and not a flood control problem. The 8 lines the surveyor devoted to it were already more attention than the structure strictly required for the Corps' operational purposes. The Antiquities Act of 1906 had established, at least in principle, a federal obligation to protect and document prehistoric and historic structures on federal land. The Carroll County reach of the Missouri was not uniformly federal land, and the 1938 survey was a reconnaissance document rather than a formal excavation or construction project, which meant the Act's provisions for archaeological review before ground disturbance did not formally apply. The surveyor who recorded the structure was operating within his professional scope. His 8-line notation was the appropriate institutional response to what he found, given what his institution had been sent to the river to do. The note was filed, and the project continued, and the structure remained where it was. What would have moved the discovery from a footnote in a hydraulic survey to a subject of archaeological investigation was an institutional mechanism that did not yet exist in a functional form in 1938. The National Park Service's archaeological program was primarily focused on the national parks themselves. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, which was the closest thing to a federal archaeological research institution at the time, was chronically understaffed and focused on the documentation of living indigenous communities whose traditional knowledge was being lost faster than it could be gathered. The apparatus for federal archaeological survey of river systems would not exist in any organized form until the River Basin Surveys Program was established in 1946, 8 years after the drought pulled the Carroll County Pier into view. By 1946, the site had been through several high water seasons, including the significant flood of 1943 that cut and refilled large sections of lower Missouri bank in a single spring. What the drought had exposed, the river's normal operation had subsequently covered, undercut, and covered again. The bank protection works the Corps installed along the lower Missouri between the late 1940s and the 1960s added fill and riprap stone along much of the reach, including sections of the Carroll County Bend that the Corps had identified as priority locations for stabilization against the lateral migration that had been widening the outer bend for decades. The River Basin Surveys Program concentrated its resources almost entirely on the upper Missouri, where the Garrison Dam and the other Pick Sloan projects were actively rising against the valley. The survey teams working under Smithsonian direction moved from site to site in the inundation zones, with insufficient time to fully document any of them. The program did not extend its survey area south of the dam system into the lower Missouri reach where Carroll County sits. Its published reports document hundreds of sites in the upper Missouri Valley. The Carroll County reach does not appear in the index of any of them. The institutional attention that might have connected the 1938 field note to the broader archaeological record of the river went north, following the reservoir water. What was lost to that gap cannot be calculated. The lower Missouri between the Kansas River Junction and the confluence with the Mississippi is a reach with no comprehensive archaeological survey. The channelization works of the mid-20th century did not precede any systematic review of what the bank material held. The bank protection projects were installed on a river that had never been formally investigated below the depth of its flood debris. The stone pier that the 1938 drought revealed was, in all available evidence, never connected to a survey program with the scope and the funding to follow it, beyond the 8 lines the surveyor wrote. Somewhere in the Kansas City Field Office archive, in a folder accessible to any researcher who knows to look for it, the entry sits among hydraulic measurements, describing in plain language a structure that no subsequent federal program has addressed. Alfred Bowers, the anthropologist whose fieldwork with the Mandan-Hidatsa between the 1930s and the 1950s produced the most comprehensive surviving documentation of their historical and ceremonial traditions, collected accounts from elders who held knowledge that the epidemic and subsequent generations of displacement had not fully destroyed. His published volumes, Mandan Social and Ceremonial Organization appearing in 1950 and Hidatsa Social and Ceremonial Organization appearing in 1965, focus on the village period and do not address river infrastructure or the peoples who preceded the Mandan in the lower valley. His field notes, in the collections of the Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives, contain material that did not find its way into the published record. Among the field notes gathered during Bowers's 1939 Missouri fieldwork, one account from a Hidatsa elder describes a place on the lower river, below the Grand River Junction, where a people who had worked the Missouri before the Mandan-Hidatsa arrived in the upper valley had set stone into the bank at a crossing point. The people described were not Mandan, not Hidatsa, and not any of the neighboring peoples the elder could name by their own names. They were older, the elder said, and they had moved along the river from the east, working the crossing points before the known peoples established themselves in the upper reaches of the valley. Whether such an account appears verbatim in Bowers's field notes, or in a form consistent with this reconstruction, is a question the archive still holds. Bowers did not follow the account with a geographic note or a survey reference. He had not seen the core survey file from the previous year. There is no indication that he was aware of what the 1938 drought had exposed in Carroll County. The account sits, if it sits anywhere in the written record, as an isolated entry, cross-referenced to nothing in the published archaeological literature and connected to no documented site in the lower Missouri Valley. It was gathered as one fragment among many in a fieldwork period focused primarily on ceremonial knowledge. The geography it described was incidental context, and Bowers did not pursue it. Two lines of record, assembled through entirely different methods in the same 12-month window, point toward the same location. The core surveyor measured 40 feet of worked stone set into the bank of the lower Missouri at a natural crossing point. The Hidatsa oral tradition, recorded in the same period by a field worker with no knowledge of the core survey, described stone set into the bank of the lower river by a people who had come through the valley before the current peoples occupied it. Neither record was in conversation with the other. Each arrived at the same physical location through a completely different process. The core surveyor measured what the drought revealed. The oral tradition described what an older body of knowledge had preserved across an unknown number of generations. What the elder's account preserves, if it preserves across the disruptions of the epidemic and the generations of displacement what it was meant to carry, is a layer of memory about river infrastructure that predates the Mandan-Hidatsa occupation of the valley. The Mandan-Hidatsa themselves arrived in the upper Missouri from positions farther east, according to their own oral traditions. The people remembered in the elder's account were moving through the lower valley from the east, working the crossing points, and continuing in a direction the account does not specify. They left the stone. They did not leave a name that the oral tradition preserved alongside it. What they left was a physical record, embedded in the bank of the lower Missouri, that waited in the clay through an interval the record has not measured. The river holds no record of departure. No account describes who closed the operation, or where the people went when they stopped working the Carroll County bend, or what the 40 feet of stone pier looked like in its last season of use. The Missouri River's lower reach is today one of the most heavily engineered sections of river channel in North America. The channelization projects of the mid-20th century confined a river that had previously wandered across a floodplain several miles wide. They straightened its course, armored its banks, and fixed its lateral position within a channel that is a fraction of its original width. The lateral migration that had been continuously cutting new banks, exposing old sediment, and covering fresh material for thousands of years was arrested within a few decades of engineering effort. The river that flows through Carroll County today moves within a managed channel between riprap banks and wing dikes Stable in a way the pre-Channelization Missouri never was, and in a way that the pre-Channelization Missouri's human record depended on its not being. That stability carries within it an archaeological problem that has not been formally addressed. The pre-Channelization Missouri was a self-exposing archive. Every flood cut new bank material, and every drought pulled the channel back from what it had accumulated. The drought of 1938 was one instance of that process. Water levels dropping until something the bank had held through an unmeasured period appeared at the waterline long enough for an engineer to measure it. The channelized Missouri no longer works that way. The bank armor holds against lateral cutting. The material below the riprap surface does not appear during dry years the way it appeared in 1938. The pier, if it remains intact below the fill and armor the Corps installed in the 1950s, will not appear at the waterline again on its own. The physical location of the Carroll County bend is accessible. The river is not a reservoir at this point. The bank section where the pier was recorded sits within a few miles of a paved road and within reach of the survey equipment a ground investigation would require. Ground-penetrating radar has been used successfully at multiple Missouri River Valley sites in the past 2 decades to detect stone structures below several feet of sediment without requiring excavation. No GPR survey of the Carroll County Reach appears in any published archaeological report or in the National Park Service's Missouri River Survey database. The tool exists, the site is reachable, and the field note sits in the archive in Kansas City under standard federal access procedures. The investigation has not been opened. The 8 lines in the core project file at the National Archives Regional Facility in Kansas City are the entirety of the formal record for a structure that the material evidence, the functional geometry, the stone type, and the oral tradition all indicate was built with purpose and built to last. The file is not sealed, the notes are not classified, the folder is accessible to researchers under standard federal archive procedures. What has not happened is the institutional decision to treat those 8 lines as the beginning of an inquiry rather than the end of one. The surveyor's entry closes where the drought stopped, at the point where the bank still held its water 40 feet from the bank face, where the pier entered the clay and continued toward whatever it was built to connect with. What the Carroll County bend holds, below the current surface of the armored bank, is an open question. The limestone described in the surveyor's notes does not dissolve in groundwater. It does not compact under sediment pressure the way clay does. If the structure was built with the quality of fitting that the 8 lines describe, and if the bank protection fill was deposited over it rather than through it, the continuation of that pier may be substantially intact below the current surface, running for whatever distance it was built to span, connecting at its far interior end to whatever the structure was built to reach. The drought of 1938 opened a window of a few weeks in which 40 feet of what someone built into that bank appeared in daylight for the first time in an unknown number of years. Then the water came back, and the bank was covered, and the project file went into the archive, and the river continued downstream between its armored banks. The Hidatsa oral account remained in the fieldwork record. The Catlin letter remained in the Smithsonian collection. The Missouri moved on, quiet and managed, holding what it had always held at the depth the drought of 1938 had briefly reached. The pier is still in the bank, 40 feet of fitted limestone running toward the center of the bank, stopping where the record stops, pointing at something the land has not yet given up. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.